So now you've seen one of the ways that we can construct a vector. And if you look at your vectors worksheet, you can find a class diagram that will show you the two elements of a class, the member variables and its member functions. And if you look within the member functions section of the class diagram, you can see this list of 4 special functions that all have the same name as the class, the vector class. This is how you know that a function is a constructor. The constructor is a special member function whose name is going to be the same as the class that it's defined within. So in this case, within the vector class, we have these 4 constructors, and you've already seen the syntax for the first constructor, which is called the default constructor. We know that it's the default constructor because this one doesn't take in any parameters. So the syntax looks like this. We're going to be defining the data type on the left-hand side. It's going to be a vector that holds int elements, and we're going to be calling it student IDs. So we're always going to be following it, the data type with the variable name. The next constructor is one that assumes that you already have a vector. It's called the copy constructor. And what it does is it takes in as a parameter another vector, and it's going to copy the contents of the other vector into the new vector that you are constructing. So how you would use it is like this. Just like before, we're going to be defining the data type. So we're making another vector of ints. And it's very important because when you're creating a new vector that is a copy of another vector, you got to make sure that the elements contained within this new vector are the same as what you're copying from. So we're going to be copying from the student IDs vector, which contains a list of ints. So I'm going to be defining a new vector called student IDs copy, which also is going to be a vector of ints. And you pass in as a parameter within the parentheses the vector that we want to copy from. The third constructor that you might find useful is this constructor that allows you to specify the size of the vector. So this size type, data type, is maybe not something that you've seen before, but you can kind of think of it as an unsigned int, or basically an integer whole number that is not negative. So it can be 0 or positive. This kind of is just a way that C++ can make sure that you don't put in a negative number, because it wouldn't really make sense for you to create a vector of a negative size. So this can be either 0 or more. And the way that you would use this is you specify the vector and the type of the data type of the elements contained within that vector. You give it a name, and then within the parentheses, you specify the size of that vector. So how you would visualize this is when you create it, what it's going to do is create a vector of that given size that you passed in, and it's going to initialize each element within that vector to the default value for the specific data type. So in this case, we're creating a vector of ints, and the default value is 0. So all 5 elements within the vector are going to be set to 0. The last constructor that you will find useful is the constructor that takes in what's called an initializer list. So what this allows us to do is define a constructor and just define a vector and just put all of the elements that we want within that vector directly within that singular constructor statement. So the syntax for this is, again, we're going to be defining the type of the elements that are stored within the vector. We're going to give the vector a name, in this case student IDs, and then we're not following it by parentheses. This is a special constructor that takes in that initializer list, which we will represent within curly braces. So within the curly braces, we can have a comma-separated list of the elements that we want to store within that vector. So in this case, I have 3 integer values that I want to put in this vector, and when we visualize it, we end up with a vector that contains the 3 elements that we have within the curly braces, 101, 102, and 103.